Hello, and welcome to the CAP Today webinar for Tuesday, May 24th. I'm Bob McGonnagle, the publisher of CAP Today, and I'll be your host and moderate a question and answer session after our formal presentation. Today's webinar is entitled, How Labs and Pharmacies Can Collaborate to Grow Their Respective Businesses. And this webinar is made possible by a special educational grant from XIFIN. I want to acknowledge them, and I want to thank XIFIN for their support, which has allowed us to bring you this very important webinar. As we all know, the ties and the importance of links between labs and pharmacies are one of the most critical directions that healthcare is going into, and that's why we're so happy to be able to present this to you today. Our speakers, and I'll say more about them in due course, are Kyle Fetter, who's the Chief Operating Officer of XIFIN, and David Pope, who's the Executive Vice President for Innovation and Industry Relations at OmniSYS, which is a XIFIN company. But before we begin, as always, I'd like to make a few housekeeping remarks that I think will enhance your listening and viewing today. First, we often suggest that you refresh your browser, and that way everything will be timely and synced up. You'll notice in the lower right-hand corner of your computer screen that we have a phone number for technical support. There's live help available throughout today's webinar for your help with any technical issue, whether it's the website or the sound. You can dial that at 858-345-5916. Below the slide box, you'll see a box labeled Q&A. Here you can also type in technical concerns, and there'll be people standing by to answer and help you with those questions. Of course, the Q&A box is primarily for your comments and questions for our speakers, and then you can put comments and questions in at any time during today's presentation. After their speakers have finished, I will lead a question and answer session, and we'll answer as many questions and get in as many of your comments as we can. I want you to know that the full slides and audio of today's webinar will be available in about a week at captodayonline.com. So you can review this, share it with colleagues, and enjoy it once again. You'll likely also see some follow-up emails from ourselves and from our sponsors, so I want to alert you to that fact. And finally, I want you to know, as always, CAP Today does not endorse any product or service that may be mentioned in any webinar that we put on. Any comments of mine today are purely personal, should not be taken as the policy of CAP Today or the College of American Pathologists. And now, let's turn to our presentation. As I mentioned, we've got two presenters. The first is Kyle Fetter, Chief Operating Officer of XIFIN. He did his undergraduate work at USC in Southern California and has an MBA from the University of Utah. Our second speaker is David Pope, who's a PharmD. He achieved that at the University of Georgia, and he's the EVP for Innovation and Industry Relations at OmniSYS. I said it was a XIFIN company, and it's a recent acquisition of XIFIN. It came into the XIFIN family at the end of 2021. And now, I'll ask them to begin their presentation. Kyle Fetter, please go ahead.
All right. So just by way of sort of introing the discussion, XIFIN, because of the fact that we work with so many laboratories, genetic companies, medical device diagnostic, wearable diagnostic companies, and in the revenue cycle space, as well as clinical systems like the LIS, we actually were sort of observers of the increasing trend over the course of COVID for diagnostic providers, whether it's laboratories or AP groups, to work directly with pharmacies. And that drove a lot of our interest in the space as well, because we always knew intuitively and through our customer base that there was a critical role for diagnostics in terms of the way drugs were delivered and the effectiveness of drug delivery. But what became sort of something that was intuitive and understandable based on FDA labels and things like that became much more practical in how healthcare was delivered over the course of COVID, when our laboratory customers and AP customers began to work directly with pharmacies. So today, I really am going to focus more on some broader industry trends that seem to be driving these two markets together closer and closer, and leave some of the more specific pharmacist perspective and direct pharmacy industry observations based on the broad business we currently support through OmniSYS to David, who's obviously much more qualified to speak to that experience and effectively what's going on in that marketplace in a much more detailed way. We're going to talk about not just the intersections of diagnostics and pharmacy. We're going to talk about healthcare demand and the need for better adherence to both medication and testing. The growth of specialty pharmacy and how that's driving greater consumption of diagnostics and why. And then effectively the trend of more care being delivered through pharmacies and even broad retail pharmacies, which is why you see these large acquisitions and mergers and sort of development of health hubs and minute clinics effectively alongside of a growing amount of clinical services that are getting performed by pharmacists. So that actually plays a critical role with consumer behavior, which we'll talk about a little bit, in addressing certain gaps in the healthcare market in terms of treatment, and especially in light of what we've seen throughout the COVID in terms of visit trends and things like that. David will obviously get much more into the changing role of the pharmacist and how they have to test to treat, and increases in prescription authority, meaning that pharmacists are actually not just becoming have a need for lab data, but they are becoming an orderer in an increasing scale of magnitude of laboratory testing. And then he'll also speak to different areas around the expansion of clinical services in the pharmacy. And we'll talk more as well about where we're starting to see the integration and the development of companies that are really sort of merging to treat certain indications and why they're doing that. And then, of course, we'll talk about technology trends for pharmacy and diagnostic providers, with David also giving you a good sense of what the road forward is. And we really want to provide some more practical input on how our customers on both sides, both the pharmacy and the diagnostic side, can continue to enhance their partnerships together to both increase their business and provide better patient care. So we will speak to all of those things and hopefully have a chance to answer a bunch of your questions as well. So first of all, the intersection of diagnostics and pharmacy is becoming much, much more clear. That you've got broad trends throughout the industry in companion diagnostics and genetics. I think one thing that, especially on the pathologist side, we're very familiar with is sort of the number of different targeted treatments in spaces like oncology. There's many different companion diagnostics requirements in oncology, but it's also growing into other areas of chronic disease. So effectively, for pharmacies that are going deeper and deeper into the specialty pharmacy space, the requirement to actually have companion diagnostic testing, next-gen sequencing, and even pharmacogenomics is increasing. You've got pharmacogenetic indications on labeled on over 200 different FDA labels for medications. So there's increasing awareness of the need for that type of data around other types of drugs. So the key point being, when you're dealing with more specialty medications, the requirement for diagnostics is growing. And I think this is a great opportunity for our laboratory and anatomic pathology industry to work and collaborate directly with pharmacy to make sure that they are getting that testing data that's required often to get the authorizations and fulfill these types of drug orders. You've got you've got the common routine testing that's obviously critical and in many cases now being ordered by pharmacists, and David will talk more about that. You've got INR, you've got liver function testing, blood counts, et cetera, and you've got the monitoring of toxicology reports, which is obviously critical in terms of really being able to understand the different types of drugs that patients are actually on, whether they're getting a toxic dose of anything, and whether there's going to be any adverse reactions based on what they're getting prescribed. Pathology, obviously from a pathologist perspective, there's been broad awareness that there's a lot of different types of IHCs and other areas of anatomic pathology that actually drive whether a patient is indicated for certain medications. A great example is PD-L1 being an indicator potentially for patients on immunotherapy in cancer. So that's obviously continues to be the types of integration that are going to be required for oncologists that are treating patients, as well as those pathologists that service them. Medical device, where obviously for many years there's been glucose monitoring, and that has been hooked up and performed at the pharmacy. And obviously this plays a critical role in glucose control medication, and there will continue to be more and more interplay between wearable diagnostics and the pharmacy in the coming years. So a couple of important trends to talk about here. We've got really the fact of a broader industry trend that's been going on for many, many years. I think possibly plugged as the chart of the century by economist Mark Perry. It shows really the effective rise in healthcare costs as it compares to all other rises in other consumer areas. So obviously, hospital services in terms of rising costs has risen the most. I think that's pretty well understood. Over the course of 20 years, it's gone to being over 200% higher than where it was in 1998 in terms of consumer price. But separately, medical care services in general have also gone up 120%. So there's acute awareness of the rising cost of healthcare, generally speaking, in terms of how care gets delivered at private practices as well as hospitals. Importantly, that's where pharmacies play a critical area. It's well established as one of the more cost-effective places to deliver care, and it's also considered a very consumer-centric delivery point for care. So it will continue to be focused on by payers as a potential more efficient delivery mechanism for healthcare. And that's why you continue to see this growing investment by retail pharmacies and many other pharmacy companies into the minute clinics and other more efficient care modalities. But another really important indication that we're all much more acutely aware of as an industry in the diagnostic side is this gap in diagnosis visits in 2020. So back in early 2021, IQVIA established a framework for thinking about the impact of COVID-19 on the U.S. and specifically on the health system and life sciences companies. So one of the more remarkable signals of disruption was the conclusion that we missed almost 1 billion diagnostic visits in 2020 as a result of COVID-19. These missed visits represent a wide range of patients. It's chronic care patients, it's acute children, it's adults, not all of whom are just waiting in the wings for additional care at this point. And to that extent, even total prescriptions for pediatrics were down 25% as of June of 2021. So this obviously resulted in in a huge gap in diagnostic work that would have been done. And the impact of that lack of work that was done in 2020 and 2021 will impact the industry for a number of years to come and continues to this day. So, it is a poignant time to be discussing how we can get closer to the patient in light of what really has become an overwhelming gap of care. Health services utilization index are still at 82% of pre-COVID levels, right? So effectively, IQVIA, who tracks the median health services utilization index, indicates the U.S. is still operating at 82%, but diagnostics used to screen and monitor cancer dropped dramatically and then had recovered, but there's still an 11 to 23% deficit. So for those of us who actively treat in terms of the oncology community and cancer patients or potential cancer patients, there still remains a huge deficit in the types of diagnostics that we were performing pre-COVID. And the median health service utilization index across states is 89, Utah still being the highest, and West Virginia being the lowest. So still a pretty profound gap in health services utilization across the entire country underway currently. However, while that trend goes in one direction, the utilization of health services at the pharmacy by pharmacy customers has continued to trend up. So obviously there are intuitive drivers of that, such as the vaccinations, but it's also seen a huge increase in routine screenings. So effectively from 2019 to 2021, we've seen an over 20% increase in the number of patients that are using health and wellness services at pharmacy locations. Generally speaking as well, a number of these customers continue to utilize more mobile applications than patients have ever used in the past, which obviously stands with the rest of the industry in terms of trends in digital health. They're consuming through technology and prefer it by a massive scale of magnitude. Another important piece to call out is consumers who use healthcare applications tend to generate more revenue, right? That drives adherence. It drives more adherence to testing models. So it's become a more critical piece to integrate diagnostic information into pharmacies simply for the purpose of making sure that both pharmacists and patients are aware of the interplay between the diagnostic results that they receive through their ordering physician and the medications that they're currently on, and there's huge demand for that. And consumer demand for real-time diagnostic and treatment data and trend data shows they are more likely to see a pharmacist multiple times a year than they are their specialty or primary care physician. So it is the most likely touch point that diagnostic providers as well as pharmacies are obviously going to see patients through that. So it's one of the best channels to deliver healthcare applications and really a driver of why diagnostic information needs to be integrated into the pharmacy, which David will talk a little bit more about. So one of the huge trends in the industry over the past 10 years has been the massive increase in specialty medicine prescriptions. This covers many different areas of chronic conditions, including oncology, autoimmune, mental health, diabetes, respiratory, all over the map. And effectively, we've seen we've seen the number of specialty medicines as a percentage of the revenue go from just over a quarter in 2010 to over 50% in 2020. So specialty medicines have effectively doubled, and also they've more than doubled, but they are more than half of the revenue for pharmacies in the country. Importantly, again, one of the areas that we'll continue to focus on is the huge need for diagnostics and specialty medicine that paces quite a bit more than what they've done in non-specialty pharmacy delivery. So there will continue to be huge demand for diagnostics simply because of the growth in specialty medicine and the driver it has for coverage, as well as the driver it has for value-based medicine agreements. So in the case of pharmacy, whereas diagnostics has been slower to see value-based pricing agreements, in the pharmacy market, it's much more established, and they're continuing to adopt more and more of those pricing models throughout the pharmaceutical industry. Another critical area to keep in mind for your practice, especially from a diagnostic perspective, is generally speaking, it is now understood that there's these huge gaps in healthcare infrastructure in generally speaking, over 80% of the country. However, there's those gaps, depending on where you are in the country, are both pharmacy, but also primary care, hospital care, and because over 90% of healthcare patients will see and live actually within 2 miles of a pharmacy, most of them will most frequently go to their pharmacy. So the pharmacy covers a huge gap in the healthcare desert and is one of the large reasons there will continue to be more and more healthcare services driven through pharmacies. So in addition to it being more effective, it's just more pragmatic because they're closer to patients and patients go there more frequently. So you're seeing an increased number of patients that will see their screening and health and wellness services simply because of proximity. So obviously that's driving a huge need in that market, and that's why you'll continue to see sort of the expansion of these healthcare hubs, minute clinics, as well as pharmacists who deliver cares, which is obviously separate from the trend you see in the minute clinics, but also why it's important to continue to think about the pharmacist as a customer for the diagnostic community. And with that, I'll kick it over to David.
Thanks, Kyle. So as we double click into that just a bit further and we look at what the pharmacy landscape looks like, ultimately you have chains, independents, and health systems out there. About 42,000 chains. Again, that would consist of your CVS's and Walgreens, Walmart of the world. Independent pharmacies, these do have aggregators, but collectively these are the local pharmacies that are out there, about 20,000 of them, and then about 1,500 health systems have outpatient pharmacies. If we go in a bit further, we actually see that the market itself is mobile in many ways. And so if we look at just the chain piece, again, first and foremost, the top 3 represent about 25,000 of those 60,000 pharmacies. And so if you think about CVS and Walgreens, they both have about 10,000 apiece. Walmart has about 5,300 around there. And so you have the top 7 ultimately comprise a significant amount of the pharmacies across the country. The remaining, there's about 5,000 of your mid-market pharmacies as well. Those would be kind of your regional chains and grocers, mass merchants, that sort. And then, of course, you have your outpatient hospital pharmacies as well, which are alive and well. Ultimately, this means that we have coverage. 9 out of 10 U.S. Citizens today live within 5 miles of a pharmacy today. Now, if you take a look and see what, again, the pharmacies have been doing and can do from a clinical service perspective, it's estimated that U.S. pharmacies can provide approximately 450 million clinical service encounters per year based on its current capacity. And so that's about 1.5 times current volumes. But as we see here on this next slide, pharmacies have been offering clinical services to date. In fact, if you look at what pharmacy has been doing in the vaccine space, it started off with just flu several years ago, again, in the early 2000s. And fast forward to today, where now about 80% of all COVID vaccinations are given in the pharmacy right now. If we look at actually on a per location basis, this is we've seen that the pharmacy has capacity to offer clinical service. Those clinical services you see here from a chain perspective, the average chain per store was giving almost 6,000 vaccines. And even on the food and mass merchant side, again, they're giving over 4,000 of those vaccines as well. So these pharmacies are, in fact, moving, they're operating, and again, as the pandemic moved forward, it really hyperdrived their desire to be able to offer clinical service. You may have known your pharmacy as in the past as a pharmacist who was the purveyor of medicine, and now they're doing so much more. Their roles are expanding. They're getting into chronic disease management. They're partnering with hospitals for outpatient services and meds to beds program. Not just meds to beds on the first fill, but first fill to refill. Ultimately, that we can keep them out of the hospital and engage them with their providers. They're also conducting therapeutic interchange. Again, the majority of states today have specific laws, rules in place for pharmacies to be able to assist in therapeutic interchange. They're assisting in minor ailment care. I think about that combined with health and wellness care. Pharmacies today in almost 24 states now can prescribe a variety of clinical services. They can prescribe for things like hormonal contraceptives, statins, and the like. And so, again, our pharmacies are, in fact, engaging with their patients. And they're doing so at a rate and a clip that's quite fast, simply because the patients who have chronic disease see their pharmacist about 10 times more frequently than they see other healthcare providers. In fact, a patient with diabetes can see their pharmacist somewhere between 15 and 27 times per year. And so, again, the opportunity is there. It does take some enabling technology, and it also requires enabling data. And that's where we'll drive the conversation to next from a lab perspective. Just a bit further on some other things that they're doing, however, I think about specialty. And specialty, again, care is all about, again, treating this patient, again, from a holistic perspective, again, engaging labs, engaging the providers, the prescribers, everything in between to be able to be what many will call the front door of healthcare, which is the pharmacy, so that pharmacists can begin to not just say the drug is right, but also assist in gathering the data to determine, along with the rest of the healthcare team, again, the effectiveness of that medication so that they can drive, capture, and, again, align the patient, the pharmacist, and the provider. So there is some new legislation that pharmacists are acting upon. They're utilizing today, and more is to come as well. You know, the traditional care model now is shifting very much to alternative care. We've seen that in many ways. Of course, it's been rebalanced post-COVID, if there is something called post-COVID, that's for sure. But there are some key drivers. I think about just the aging population and the number of patients on a U.S. adults today who are, getting into Medicare at this time. Again, we know that, we have an increased morbidity risk, and prediabetes and other chronic diseases are on the rise. We also have the provider networks that are incredibly strained. You know the list, again, but certainly some of that has involved pharmacy. And pharmacy and pharmacists are now being seen more and more as providers. The majority of states today recognize pharmacists as providers in one way, shape, or form. Now, some of that is for actual fee-for-service opportunities. Some of that is also for value-based care and some of the things that we mentioned in the previous slide. But there is new legislation that recognizes pharmacists as providers that is being considered in this year on a national level. So U.S. House of Representatives, again, introduced new legislation on March 24th. It's called the Equitable Community Access to Pharmacist Services Act. That's H.R. Bill 7213, which authorizes pharmacists to provide care and receive reimbursement for pandemic-related services related to our nation's seniors. The American Pharmacists Association, its members, and pharmacy as a whole is vigorously advocating for this passage and enactment of the bill, which would grant pharmacists a full provider status under specific circumstances. This also would establish reimbursement mechanism on the federal side for pharmacists under Medicare Part B. And why is that? Well, we know that pharmacists make a significant impact on patients' health outcomes. Their overall health, they reduce overall healthcare costs. And again, they are not doing this on a silo or on their own island. They're using technology now that enables them to be able to share this data and information with their primary care provider, with the lab organizations, again, and receive all of this information. One example of that would be the test-to-treat model, as we've all heard about, where pharmacists is by all means engaging with a positive COVID test, and in some instances is prescribing. Again, I think about the state of Florida today, where pharmacists can actually test for flu, for strep, and for COVID. And for flu and strep, they can actually prescribe in that point as well, based on the results as well. So provider status legislation is happening today on a state level. It's moving forward very quickly. Again, and on a national level, it's gaining steam. So why do pharmacies, in fact, need lab data? Well, we can put that into three separate buckets. The first is fee-for-service. Pharmacists can actually act as a referral source to labs. So if you're a lab organization on the call today, again, you can partner. In fact, you may have already partnered with pharmacy to be able to engage them for referrals. Again, the majority of the large market, as an example of that, did in fact partner with pharmacy and labs together to be able to provide some outsourced modeling and testing for COVID as well. So pharmacies can act as a referral source either to you. They're also offering tabletop equipment. Again, they're offering the tabletop equipment, again, to be able to test at times right then, right there. Now, when they do that, they are maintaining the patient relationship in many ways. And so, again, they may be the referral agent. Sometimes they're actually using a collaborative practice agreement to be able to do that. But they, in fact, are the ones who are delivering the message back to the patient. And so it's vital that they actually receive that lab data so that they can, number one, coordinate care. They may be able to actually provide the treatment themselves. They're using that as a mechanism for billing in a number of ways as well. So fee-for-service is item number one. Pharmacies are also using lab data for value-based care. Now, if we look at more of the chronic disease management types of labs, your CBCs of the world, again, pharmacists are now entering into relationships with payers. And those payers, again, are essentially saying, pharmacists, I need you to reach my hardest to reach patients. I need you to counsel them. I need you to prescribe when necessary. I need you to coordinate care. I need you to educate. And all of those things combined together are more of a value-based care in the shared savings type of program. And so they need lab data in order to engage with their patients. Here's an example of that. There are chains and mid-markets and independents today who are all alike partnering with national payers right now who are in states where pharmacists can, in fact, prescribe a statin. Now, before you prescribe a statin, especially with patients living with diabetes, you need a liver function test, and you need to be able to evaluate that. Of course, you need a cholesterol test as well. Pharmacies are not providing liver function tests in-house, and so they need a partner to be able to leverage that. When the patient comes in the door, again, many times that is driven by the payer to ask the patient and draw the patient to the pharmacy for this service. And ultimately, the pharmacist is taking that blood sample, or again, partnering if need be, sending that sample out to a lab to be tested. That data is electronically being sent back to the pharmacy, and that pharmacy is then acting upon that and many times prescribing a statin for that patient living with diabetes. Again, there are very specific guardrails for pharmacy, as you can imagine, from a pharmacist perspective. Again, if we are going to allow pharmacists to prescribe, again, they are not usurping the authority of the physician in any way. They're increasing access in this regards and providing alternative pathways there, as we mentioned earlier. And so, again, there are specific guardrails. States and boards of pharmacy alike all have very specific pathways for pharmacists to act when it's in this manner. It's not just a carte blanche pathway there. There's certainly some guardrails around that. And the third area is with diagnostics and pharmacogenetics. And so we think about specialty medication workflows, as Kyle mentioned earlier. There is a need many times to be able to get a white blood cell count. I think about clozapine as an example to that. Again, we might be determining if the drug is right, again, based off of labs. Again, if it trips the wire, then we're not able to prescribe or dispense the medication. But we're also looking at the ability to be able to determine effectiveness of that medication. So Post-COVID, what does the landscape look like, and what does the strategy look like? We know that there is excess COVID testing capacity right now. Again, labs have been engaging in that way for some time as the number of tests decreases. Again, at the moment at least, there is still a gap there in what we can do versus what's needed. Again, there was a time, as we all remember, when that was reduced. And we also know, as a second step here on a landscape perspective, is that payers are increasingly restricting coverage. Again, they're always trying to find a way to be able to say we're not going to pay for this because, and again, there's a lot of things that we could go into and have its own webinar. We also know, again, that because of this shift to pharmacy, again, labs and pharmacy are partnering together for test and treat, for rapid test and treat services, for complex tests. Again, they represent real opportunity for both lab and pharmacy. Pharmacy is looking to be seen as a new healthcare destination apart from the medication side. Lab is seeking to expand and be able to expand, especially in light of excess COVID capacity. And so there are plenty of pathways now and examples where we're seeing where lab and pharmacy are in fact working together in many ways through either collaborative practice agreements or in direct access as well. Ultimately, that leads to addressing additional unmet needs. Again, diagnostics, they're essential to identification and management of disease. It's critical for controlling transmission of infectious disease. Again, so pharmacy and lab working together truly does impact the health of healthcare. So as we look at what's happening from a strategic perspective, we look at the linkage between lab and pharmacy, and there certainly has been something happening in the space. There's a ripple in the force, and that is that XIFIN, again, most recently, as we mentioned earlier, about 6 months ago, again, did acquire OmniSYS, the leading provider of healthcare technology in the pharmacy space that serves from a medical billing, from clinical documentation and electronic health record, and patient engagement pathway. And why is that? There are several important linkages between laboratory diagnostics data and pharmacy data. Now, XIFIN's lab customers, they provide critical diagnostics for patients, while OmniSYS pharmacy customers both prescribe and fulfill patient treatments. So understanding the real-world impact of diagnostics on patient treatment decisions is broadly considered as critical for advancing personalized medicine initiatives. So combining OmniSYS and XIFIN together brings together labs and pharmacy. Pharmacy needs that not only from a pharmacist, retail pharmacy perspective, but as we begin to see the emergence of pharmacy-based clinics. Those clinics are run by either physicians, physician's assistants, or nurse practitioners. Again, we now have a triad of data sources that ultimately is needed on every level. So the combined patient-provider engagement tools, also with XIFIN and OmniSYS, can drive that medication and diagnostic adherence. It's good for both patient care and as well as it's good for pharma and lab revenue. So we know that pharmacy is absolutely the new entrant into the lab market. What are they doing? Again, we think about them from both a clinic perspective. Again, that would be a clinic that's based, again, as I mentioned a moment ago, from a physician, physician's assistant, nurse practitioner, based inside the four walls of the pharmacy. Ultimately, just as a point of reference, those clinics really do act as a separate entity in many ways to the pharmacy itself. Again, there's not as many pharmacy clinics out there today, although they are growing in numbers, specifically in the large market. However, we're talking about unleashing all 63,000 pharmacies now for clinical service, especially in the lab market. Again, this is due to the fact that it's more convenient and less expensive. This trend is certainly being driven by the changing regulatory trends that we mentioned a moment ago that ultimately enable pharmacists to perform more clinical services, directly order, perform, and get reimbursed for testing. So what's the next major opportunity here? Again, pharmacists are engaging in patient engagement. As we talked about earlier, pharmacy being, quote, the front door of healthcare. Again, and the battle for that ultimately. And that data, there is a need for pharmacy to be able to engage in those clinical services. There's also a renewed need for pharmacy to be able to provide lab results. Again, at times they may need to interpret those results. At times they may just need to deliver those results. But lab results and pharmacy are directly linked. My background is in pharmacy and specifically in diabetes management. And of course, as everyone knows, the A1C drives the treatment in many ways. The patient drives the treatment, right, as a holistic approach. But the A1C is absolutely driving a major part of the treatment modalities that we may determine for that patient. We're asking the patient to actually interpret that for them in and of themselves as well, again, from a daily perspective with small blood glucose testing, as well as with the A1C. And so how does that engage the patient? There are technologies that are needed that bridge the gap between lab and pharmacy, ultimately to the patient as well. As I mentioned a moment ago, pharmacy is engaging with payers for clinical services in a variety of ways. They are getting credentialed and contracted today as individual providers, and they're engaging the payer for value-based care as well. They're looking at treatment adherence for patients, again, that are taking, for example, specialty medications. We need to ensure that they are taking that medication as much as possible. And when they're not, we need to understand why so that we can refer, we can engage with that patient in that way. They're offering testing and treatment. We've seen that with COVID. We've seen that with flu and with strep and the infectious disease pathway. It's honestly just the beginning. As I mentioned a moment ago, pharmacists are now prescribing statins as well as other medications throughout the country today. And then finally, as we look at the physician side, again, none of this is to say that we are usurping the authority of the provider, the physician in any way, but there needs to be a way that physicians receive this data that a pharmacist is gathering, whether it be through lab testing or through training, education, and again, I think about the adherence pathway, all of those things, but it needs to go into the EMR as well. And so there's a huge need for pharmacy to be able to engage with the EMR. And I'm excited to say that pharmacies are, in fact, doing that already today. With that, I'll turn it back over to Kyle.
Yep. Thanks so much, David. And I'll kind of cruise through this, but what we really wanted to talk about for a minute here is you are seeing integrated care organizations being developed right now around different patient disease states and issues in general areas, and mental health is obviously one of those critical areas for us as a country. Percentage of adults with a mental illness who reported an unmet need for treatment has increased every year since 2011. In fact, in 2019, 24.7% of adults with a mental illness reported an unmet need for treatment, and that's only gotten worse over the case of COVID as we've looked at mental health as an ongoing and growing issue. So it's not a surprise that one of the things we wanted to talk about was a case study where actually one of our customers now is certainly owning and merged with both a pharmacy as well as a treatment clinic as well as a laboratory. And in providing that integrated care model, they are routinely seeing a 52% increase in patient retention, 44% fewer relapse events, and 43% less drug-related utilization with a net promoter score of 88. So very positive results that we're seeing in the mental health space. Beyond that, in community oncology, there's a huge need, as we spoke about a little bit earlier, for companion diagnostics, routine testing, and a number of other key areas of anatomic pathology. We all know that inherently. It's a $157 billion annual cost, and again, most types of cancers and many of the major drugs have specific companion diagnostics that are indicated in many cases. So I don't say this specifically to as a message to any customers that we have either on the pharmacy side or on the anatomic pathology side or on the laboratory side to say that we think that people should be merging up with practices. But I think what diagnostic providers truly need to think about, as well as pharmacy providers, is how to better integrate themselves into these vertical healthcare market specialties. How do you service a mental health clinic or operation? How do you service a community oncology group effectively and provide them the broadest scope of services? But also, how do you make sure that the correct interplay of information happens to both drive coverage and drive coverage not just fee-for-service, but also under value-based pricing models? We know the demand is there from the payer side. We know the demand is there from the pharmacy side. And from a diagnostic side, obviously, we want to continue to stay relevant in terms of catering to these vertical markets. So we mentioned mental health and community oncology because you're seeing so much collaboration between diagnostics and drug delivery in those particular spaces, but it's growing in many other chronic conditions. So as you continue to think about your practice, it's important to understand, okay, if you're a practice, how do you actually sell to a pharmacist if they're not the ones who are ordering your test? Well, in many cases, you don't sell directly to the pharmacist, but you do set up integration with some of the key pharmacies in your community. That's a huge driver for an ordering physician that you're potentially looking to partner with in other areas, being able to say, yep, we're already integrated to the following different pharmacies, so we can provide this type of diagnostic data routinely both to you and directly into their system. That removes a major hassle from ordering physicians throughout the country. So integrating between sort of the pharmacy management system, the practice management system, to those of you in the diagnostic space or even the radiology space from the RIS or the laboratory information system, pushing those test results directly out of those clinical systems and into the EHR is critical, and I'll pass it to David to talk a little bit more about that.
That's right. So pharmacies today, again, you would imagine that they would certainly have a prescription system that will place a label on a bottle, again, that does all the things necessary for the prescriptive process, for billing the prescription, for also allowing for the signature pad and the cash pay, all of those things. Pharmacy now is adopting an EHR of their own. It's a very specific EHR style, again, that's meant for pharmacists. And again, here's an example of one as well. But I just want to clarify, because one of the common misconceptions is that I would love to work with the pharmacy, but they work on an island. They work via fax, and it's no longer the case. Pharmacies today, in fact, the vast majority of pharmacies today, especially on the large market side, have adopted, in fact, an electronic health record. That electronic health record can both send and receive that clinical data. Think about lab data as an example of that. Again, it's spoken in the language of healthcare, that's HL7. The EHR today, again, this example here is an electronic health record by OmniSYS that's utilized by a majority of the landscape today. And again, it receives information in HL7 format, speaks in medical informatics language of LOINC and SNOMED CT and the like, for those of you who are medical informaticists on the call, and communicates as such as well. For diagnostic testing, again, it's reporting to for electronic lab reporting agencies and the like. Again, so the pharmacy of today is adequately prepared to be able to engage and connect with the lab organizations, with the EHRs of the world, not just so that we can receive information from a pharmacy perspective, but so that we can share that information from the pharmacist back to the organizations, again, and the care team as well. So as we look at and kind of land this plane here, as we look at the road ahead, what does it look like? First of all, there's been a lot that we've discussed today, and there are so many different dynamics that are changing. But in a post-COVID world, we do know that the pharmacy, again, is a wonderful partner of lab, again, both as a referral source as well as for many other opportunities there that ultimately lead to patient engagement, patients, improving the patient's health, as well as the health of healthcare and driving revenue for partner organizations within the landscape. And so as we look at specialty pharmacy, there are huge dynamics happening right now. There is a movement back away from the hub model in which there might be one location for the entire Southeast that would serve as a specialty pharmacy. We now know that we're moving back into what we would call specialty light, where some of those specialty medications are actually going back to the local pharmacy as well. In order to do that, they need the adequate data and need to be able to send and receive that data. Much of that data involves lab data. The patient experience reigns king for all involved, whether that's the physician, the pharmacist, the lab, whatever it may be, and it needs to be a cohesive patient experience. And so those are some of the things that, of course, that XIFIN and OmniSYS, those matter to us as well. We've got to take a look at, again, the pharmacy reimbursement landscape. Pharmacy is traditionally on a pharmacy benefit side. However, this is quickly moving back over to the medical side as well. Pharmacy is increasingly submitting claims on the medical side. That leads to credentialing and contracting on an individual level for pharmacists. That's net new. So if you're familiar with pharmacy billing, in the past, pharmacies as an organization have typically enrolled with a payer from a pharmacy organization level. Many times that's been specific or unique just to the pharmacy side. But now that's all changing. The reimbursement landscape is changing as a result of that. Pharmacists have their own NPI. They're enrolling in the national payers as we speak. One of the big drivers of that, honestly, and who is paying for this, is the Medicaid. Again, as we look at state Medicaid, they really were the first to begin this whole process from a reimbursement perspective for that, from a lab perspective, as well as all the way down to the pharmacist billing on an individual level. So what is also, again, just to finish this up, there is a lot of activism happening right now with pharmacists as providers, again, as a part of the healthcare team. We believe firmly that the pharmacist has proven themselves, certainly over through the pandemic season, again, not to pull from, but to add to. And so with that, again, we're excited about the days to come and ultimately the road ahead. So with that, I'll turn that back over to the moderator.
David Pope, thank you very much, and thank you also to Kyle Fetter for a very stimulating program. If you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, we have a few minutes left. I'm going to jump right in, and I'm going to direct this first question to Kyle Fetter, and then, of course, David will also opine. We have people interested in the payer recognition of pharmacists as independent providers of lab tests for reimbursement purposes. In other words, talk about payers that will reimburse a lab test ordered by a pharmacist who may not be part of a collaborative practice agreement with a physician. Kyle?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's more, we can pull up some more specific information for the asker and certainly pass it on. But, there's obvious testing scenarios that are covered, in terms of COVID antibody testing, as well as other types of COVID testing by pharmacists that are going to be covered by mandate. But there are other types of testing, as David pointed out earlier, that are routinely covered. I don't think it's payer specific. Is that right, David? There's, in many cases, the types of testing that are covered by pharmacists are basically broadly covered, at least in the states where they have the prescription authority to order them, right?
Sure. So it's a multi-layer approach here. So step one would be, does the state or federal mandate allow for it, right? Because this is an emerging market by all means, and it is disparate based on the state that you're in. So after we get past just state law in that regard, and again, the majority of them have either restrictive pathway that says you have to have a collaborative practice agreement, or some just say, you're a provider, you can do whatever, again, within your scope of practice. And so that would be step one. Step two would be, do the payers allow for this? And that normally involves a process that the payer then determines, again, and we do see some disparity here, where many times the payer will say, you know what, we enjoy pharmacists as providers, just as the state allows, and so we would allow that as well. You need to get credentialed and contracted, or you need to go through a delegated credentialing service, whatever it may be. And so that's pathway number one. There is another path that we see where some payers are saying, you know what, it's kind of the chicken or the egg thing. We're not ready for pharmacists yet. Yes, we will, and we're planning on that, but we need let's just get you into the pharmacy organization. And so I won't go into the detail of payers. As Kyle mentioned, we can provide that as a follow-up. But again, the number one kind of group as a whole would be the state Medicaid. They are absolutely allowing pharmacists in some states to be able to do that as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So it's very interesting. Today we have a group of participants, many of whom are from labs, as you might imagine, but we have a large number of retail pharmacies and other pharmacists who are on. So I'm going to start with the obvious questions that people have. How can my pharmacy start working with a lab? Can you offer some counsel on that? First David and then Kyle.
Great question. So if you're a pharmacy today and you have a strategy to engage in point of care testing as an example to that, you first of all need you need the state regulation, right? You need to be able to satisfy those types of pathways that are required to be able to test first and foremost. The second aspect of that would be you need an enabling technology. You need a technology that allows you to be able to tell the lab organization, I'm ready. I'm ready to be able to send, and I'm ready to receive that information. I'm ready to be able to tell my patients is an example of the technology as well as that's needed. And so there's a data aspect of this, there's a workflow, and there's an interoperability play here. And then, again, your enabling technology can also assist you in partnering with a lab. Again, so as I think about, again, the pharmacy who raises their hand that says, I'm willing, can you make me able? And so we'd encourage you to reach out to the labs that you're familiar with. You can take a look at your payer mix out there and those that and who is required in that regard. I will say that there's a special opportunity, I believe, for lab organizations to quickly move and partner and align themselves with pharmacy, because if those technology roads are not built, it's going to make it exponentially more difficult for the pharmacy to be able to serve their people. And so it's a two-way street. And so I would encourage pharmacy, reach out to the labs that you're familiar with and strike up that conversation. Take a look at your payer alignment as well. And at the same time, labs out there, I would encourage you as well to engage in the pharmacies in the areas in which you serve.
Bob, I think David said it well. So if there's another one, let's do it. Another question.
Yes, I wanted to ask the following questions. As we all know, we're dealing in large national consolidations, not only of pharmacies, as you've shown, but also of laboratories on national levels. Do you know of any pharmacies that are starting to engage at national lab levels, or is most of this activity so far restricted to regional pockets, as you mentioned in state Medicaid situations? David.
So David, I think there's some pretty big national relationships between laboratories and pharmacies that are published, right? I mean, at least things like Walgreens and LabCorp and other sort of stated relationships. But from the perspective, at least of XIFIN, that on those things that aren't maybe as apparent nationally, we're seeing tons of regional activity between regional labs and regional mid-market pharmacies as well as independent pharmacies. It's obviously heavily driven by COVID, but we're seeing those partnerships expand, and I think it's a huge opportunity for regional labs to work with mid-market and independent pharmacies right now, and will continue to be in the coming years.
Thank you. And let me ask one more question, which I think is on everyone's mind here. Aren't we really talking about a lab, whether national or regional, really networking and starting to share experience and patient data and even acquaintance between their ordering physicians, their own laboratory, and the pharmacies in their region, however big or however small. Kyle Fetter.
Yeah, I think it absolutely is about that, and it's a great question. I think what you're seeing is, because of increased pressure on the insurance side, you're seeing that all of these different parties that you mentioned, you've got patient, you've got physician, lab, and pharma. All of them are seeing impacts on reimbursement that have a codependency on each of the different areas of the healthcare continuum. So an ordering physician who's not going to get covered for certain services and certain prescriptions and other types of things, a laboratory that's not going to get covered if it's not affiliated with the correct condition and or driving a certain decision, and you've got pharma who's with the increasing specialty pharmacy prescriptions not going to get covered for certain drugs if the right diagnostic isn't performed. So I think it really is about networking and collaboration between patient data and all those groups.
Kyle, thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to give you the last word. And actually, it's a last word that's a very encouraging word for all who are on the call today, because many of these anxieties and concerns affect all the players in healthcare, physicians, laboratories, and pharmacies. So it's been a very, very interesting and eye-opening presentation. It gives a lot of food for thought about activities that anyone can undertake to improve these sorts of relationships and networks, and so I want to thank you. And then as I wrap up, then let me just once again thank Kyle Fetter and David Pope, both of XIFIN. I want to thank XIFIN for their sponsorship of this very special program. You'll be able to see it again and hear it again on captodayonline.com in about a week, and I recommend that you go back. There's a lot of nuggets in here and lots of interesting data about the healthcare system. Then finally, I want to thank all of you. You've taken time out of your busy day to join us, and we're always very grateful for that. We really mean that. We enjoy putting these things on for you and look forward to future webinars, and we invite you heartily to participate. So with that, once again, thanks to Kyle Fetter, David Pope, XIFIN, and all of you. This is Bob McGonnagle, and I'll now bring this webinar to a close. Thank you.